Pleased to be joined now by NFL analyst for Athlon Sports, Doug Farrar, joining us. And Doug, thanks for the time. We know you're just getting up off the mat from Super Bowl coverage here. You had a week to recover, and now here we go. We're a week out from the NFL Combine in Indy, and we'll get into some of the strengths of this year's draft class in just a bit. But naturally, people are here in Western New York, fresh off the AFC title loss, still trying to find the missing ingredients. And there's a healthy number of free agents on this roster, as there are on every roster across the league these days, with one-year deals being more of the soup du jour. And defense is widely thought to be the offseason priority for Buffalo for some obvious reasons. People are having arguments, though, as to whether the priority should be shifted more towards the back end of this defense or more towards the front end. I'm inclined to think the front end, and it's a good year for that as far as the draft class is concerned. But what are your overarching thoughts about where the priorities lie on the Bills' defense in terms of improving it?
Well, I would agree with that. As far as the front end, I think if there's one thing we learned from the Eagles and how they put their defense together, it's that you can play intelligent zone in the back end and get pressure with four. As we all now know, and I remember watching the next gen stats on the Jumbotron as the game went on, and it's like, nope, the Eagles still haven't blitzed, they still haven't blitzed, and they've got a 38.1% pressure rate. That you can, get pressure with four and drop 7 into coverage and of course that's every defensive coordinator's ideal. If you ask Bobby Babich, he's like, well, yeah, of course I would love to do that. But the way the Eagles did things with stunts was so amazing. They stunted 11 times in that game. They never blitzed. They stunted 11 times. And when Mahomes was stunted with pressure, he was both of his interceptions, 2 sacks, 3 pressures, 3 scrambles, and he completed 2 of 5 passes for 17 yards. And what happened was they weren't doing inside stunts. It was a lot of outside stuff where basically they took their best blocker, center Creed Humphrey, out of the protection. Because Creed's like, oh, Jalen Carter's over here, Milton Williams is over here. What am I supposed to do? So I think when you spin that forward to this year's class of free agents, which if we're taking Myles Garrett out of the equation, it's a decent class. I mean, Milton Williams is going to be a free agent. He looked pretty good in a Bills uniform. That guy is amazing. But I think overall, it's not so much get, this guy for this scheme. You want to, Vic Fangio was so good at Zach Bond was a special teams guy in New Orleans, and they signed him to a 1-year nothing deal. And Howie Roseman presented him, you now have Zach Bond, this ball of clay. And Vic Fangio said, I see a lot more in this guy than he's been, that I was led to believe. He went from special teams gunner to first team all-pro linebacker in 1 year. So, yeah, it's about where he lines up, but it's really about fit and, how that all comes together. I think the Bills' defensive line, I think it's coming. There were obvious improvements, but I think it's still a line in transition as far as having not only that one force multiplier, but in having everyone work together. Because if you watch the Super Bowl tape, it wasn't just Jalen Carter blowing people up. It was how they all worked together in concert in a first year in a new system that was so amazing.
I think that's what really got a lot of people. Certainly, they made it look easy, right? Just rush 4 guys, and there's too many guys in the secondary to complete passes, particularly when the quarterback is getting pressured with just 4 guys. And, yeah, it looks easy when you can do that, but you're talking about a defense. It doesn't happen that often where a team can accumulate 4 game wreckers up front, or at least 4 guys who can wreck the game. And in this case, in Philly, is more than that because they ran like 6 or 8 guys through there.
They did.
That's as hard as finding an elite quarterback to get your team, getting all those guys. So what is the most expedient path for teams like Buffalo, who are good, very good, to get a recipe that would help them win games? Certainly, they're not going to be able to fix their entire defensive line, or not say fix, but upgrade their entire defensive rotation so they can get quick pressure with 4 guys. Everybody would love to do that every year.
Sure. Well, if you're talking about pressure with four, okay, you're not blitzing, and they had a couple of plays where Bond would blitz and they'd run a guy out in a zone exchange, so it wasn't all straight, and those stunts came in. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple days ago who's very familiar with the Bills just overall, and he said, yeah, they don't stun a lot either, and part of the reason why, and I want to maybe you guys agree with this or not, is because they would give up rushing lanes to running backs and mobile quarterbacks when they did. There was always sort of a hole. So, as much as everyone wants an edge rusher, I would love to see the Bills get that true complementary larger guy who can go everywhere from head over nose to about three tech and just wreck things inside. Because I cannot overemphasize the importance of Jalen Carter's ascent as a player in that Eagles front this year. He became everything we thought he would be coming out of college. First year, and most defensive linemen, first year, it's a bit of a transition. But if they can get, probably not a Mason Graham, but, Kenneth Grant from Michigan, who, depending on the size of the buffet, it runs anywhere from 335 to 340, that Dexter Lawrence type. And I don't want to say Dexter Lawrence type because he's one of one, but that kind of player where you have someone like a Chris Jones, like a Nnamdi Madubuike, who can not only get in there and soak up blocks for other people and make that possible, but just wreck half an offensive line by himself. I think in today's NFL, where there's so much more quick game, it's so much more 0 to 3 step drops, it's get the ball out fast. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, guys. Your edge rusher is not always going to have time to get around the edge. It's why it is so much more of a stunt league now, where your edge guys are coming inside, trying to capitalize on, that quick game and at least force the quarterback to think before he throws. It's why press man coverage is so much more important, because if you can't disrupt the quarterback, you can at least disrupt the timing of the receiver's routes with aggressive press coverage. That's kind of where the NFL is going. What I would love to see for the Bills, if they can get that transcendent inside guy, and I'm a big fan of Ed Oliver, but Ed runs about what, 280, 290? That's not really his game, and that's not a knock on Ed Oliver. It's just not how he's built. So if they can get that other guy to, 600 to 800 snaps a season, can come in there and not be a Jalen Carter or a Dexter Lawrence, but someone who can develop to that level, I think that would be incredibly important and transformational in what Babich wants to do and what the Bills want to do. Because really, when you look at what the Eagles do and what the Bills do, it's not dissimilar. The Bills do not blitz a lot. They play a ton of what I call intelligent zone. I asked Zach Bond right after the Super Bowl in those pressers, I said, tell me why Vic Fangio's coverage systems work so well. And he said, I always know where my help is. I always know where every guy is. I have absolute faith in Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, two rookies who he'd never played with before. He's coming into a new system. I always know where my help is. Well, that's how the Bills play. So they're not that far away. Like you said, they don't need to fix it. It's just refining it. I think the best possible way for the Bills to refine their defense is to start with that, not only a hole plugger up front, but a guy who can just take 2 or 3 guys and sort of demolish, half an offensive line like those top tier defensive tackles can.
Yeah, and I'm of the opinion, just by virtue of the numbers, with as many free agents as the Bills have at the defensive tackle position, the fact that Daquan Jones is a 34-year-old player, I just think defensive tackle is going to be one of the highest turnover positions for the Bills this offseason on their entire roster. You couple that with the fact that you've got a very deep draft class at the position. You mentioned flex. You mentioned position flex, Doug. I know you mentioned Kenneth Grant. How deep does the position flex go at defensive tackle in your mind in this class?
I think it's, you have a guy like Shamar Stewart, who I wrote up. I know we were talking about that. Wrote him up at 6'6", 290. And I hear people criticizing him because he can't, bend the edge like Myles Garrett. Well, he's 6'6", 290. Of course he's not going to. Focus on what he can do. This is a guy who can, from one shade to either shoulder of the center, all the way out to wide 9, can pressure your quarterback, can wreck your run game, can do all those things. I've always been a huge fan. I'm in Seattle, so I saw the ascent of Michael Bennett in the Legion of Boom. I've always loved those guys like J.J. Watt who can play anywhere along the line. Chris Jones is like that now. I love those guys where you really don't know, those jokers where you really don't know what gap he's going to go to. You just know that trouble is coming. I think it would be great if the Bills had a little more stunts, a little more gap multiplicity. I don't want to say it's vanilla. I think it's very well defined. I think it works for the most part. But if you can just get a little more of a tick in the quarterback's head, like, I don't quite know what's coming here, I think that would benefit the Bills greatly. And I think with a Mason Graham, who reminds me of Justin Smith, that's about as high a compliment as I can give. Kenneth Grant. So many interior defensive linemen in this draft, and it's a lot of position flex guys. Just as in with defensive backs, you rarely see a guy play 99% of the time outside or 99% of the time in the slot. No one's just a safety anymore. No one's just an outside corner anymore. No one is really, outside of a few guys, no one's just a zero tech nose tackle anymore. You have to be able to provide that flexibility for your team, whether it's college or pro, and certainly the transition. And I think the Bills would do well. And in a draft class like this, where it's so loaded with talent, they could really load up with more than one of those guys and really refine not only the talent but the multiplicity of those fronts.
All right, so we're about, free agencies are around the corner, and we've already heard from Myles Garrett as that he wants out of Cleveland. He's going to be available. Trey Hendrickson is a question mark in Cincinnati. They seems like they're going to have too many guys to pay, and if they're going to go all offense, it looks like he's odd man out. So he may be there. Max Crosby is in Vegas. He could give the Vegas a big return on a trade value here. So you've got these guys that kind of sort of seem like they're available. Certainly Myles Garrett has said he wants to be available. So if you get a guy like Myles Garrett, give us, that he's a game wrecker, a generational game wrecker. Am I right?
It's funny you said generational. I was just going to say, I don't use that word, but with him you have to, because he's 270? He has the speed of a 240-pound man, and he has the power of a 300-pound man. That's just weird. It's alien-like. And, that's a one of one. Like a Dexter Lawrence is one of one. You don't have a guy 340 pounds getting that many sacks inside with double teams. And the thing about Myles Garrett is you can really sort of assess your entire offensive plan to him, stop him, and you still can't do it. If you can get that guy, if you have the cap space to do it, which I know the Bills are sort of in arrears with their cap situation right now, that could take a lot of interesting math. But certainly if you could get Myles Garrett, there's no question about that. That changes your entire defense. He's one of those very few guys who can do that all by himself. I mean, that's you don't need me to come on here with my quote unquote expert analysis and tell you that. Myles Garrett is really good, and he is generational, and he is transformational to that degree. If there's some way the Bills could do that, yes, of course it would affect their defense positively in ways that we can't even imagine.
How likely is it that he's a Brown next year?
I would think if we go back to the whole Brock Osweiler thing, where there was that trade and most of the trade was to take up the contract, my personal theory and philosophy on this, the only way the Browns trade Myles Garrett is if they find someone to eat Deshaun Watson's contract with it. I would be very surprised if they just let Garrett go by himself, no matter what kind of return they got.
Yeah.
Right.
Or maybe a multi-team thing, but that gets so layered and convoluted, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
What about...
By the way, I know Pete Carroll pretty well and his feelings about edge rushers. I would be shocked if the Raiders now trade Max Crosby with Pete Carroll in charge.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I couldn't see a 73-year-old head coach deciding on a rebuild.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
He doesn't think, well, when Pete came to Seattle in 2010 and he did have a rebuild, he didn't think that way then. He just doesn't think that way. And
what about
what are
they going to do at quarterback? What are they going to do at quarterback?
Raiders?
Yeah.
Oh.
Good question.
They got to do something, though, right? I mean, they've got to make a move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had Geno Smith in Seattle. There is a guy named Shedeur Sanders who reminds me a little bit of Geno Smith. Who knows? I'm just saying. I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
Last one I got for you, Doug, because I know you try to keep your ear to the ground on developing trends as they unfold, through an offseason into a regular season. With all the nickel defense we've seen almost become base defense for a lot of clubs, we saw the counter to that from offenses being, hey, let's pull a guard and have them run right at their nickel corner and blow them up in the run game. I'm sensing this. I'm wondering if you do too, a shift where maybe a nickel package involves more third safeties. I know we see that to some degree in New England and a couple other places. I really think that's going to be the soup du jour answer for defenses. So a player like Eamon Warry from South Carolina in this year's draft becomes a very attractive player, I would think, for a lot of defenses going forward that want to stay in quote-unquote nickel personnel, but maybe need the girth to hold up against this new advent of the run game that we saw this year. What do you think about that?
No question. I've talked with our mutual friend Greg Cosell for a long time, and we've talked over the last couple of years, formally and informally, about how much more big nickel teams are playing. It's interesting. I've talked with both Mike McDonald and Steve Spagnuolo this last year on how you can run light boxes and still play heavy. And Spags told me during Super Bowl week that Justin Reed is the guy who will come down and sort of play that heavy. I found it, it's obvious that the Chiefs sold out to stop Saquon Barkley. They played three linebackers far more than I thought they would in that game. Far more, about 20 plays if you take out the kneel downs. And I think overall there is a sense that we want to play heavy with those light boxes, because you can't just, the Eagles are such a unique team. You can't sell out to stop a running back. That doesn't work because then the 3x1s will just kill you. So it is those, and that's we're talking about positional versatility in that component. Those guys who can, play out to hook curl and can stop a slot receiver, can stop a tight end, and then come down and stop the run. Yes, absolutely. So, we talk about different kinds of safeties. We talk about big nickel. Well, if you have three safeties in a nickel package, and the Bills run nickel 5,000% of the time, that's pretty much all they do. We know this. Those safeties can be different kinds of safeties too. It's not just, okay, we have three headbangers, this is what we're doing. So it is something to look at. I think, big nickel and stunts are two of the things I've seen from defenses in the last couple of years where it really is increasing both in frequency and then in complexity. So I would absolutely say that, yes, that could be a big thing overall in the NFL, and certainly a big thing for the Bills.
Yeah, because you mentioned Spags and the Chiefs. They had an first-team All-Pro nickel corner in Trent McDuffie, and they moved him outside and put Shamari Connor, who's a safety by trade, but good enough to cover in the slot and good enough to cover in the hook zone, I would say, in my opinion anyway, from watching him. And that kind of diversified their defense to, yes, Jalen Watson was injured, and that was part of the reason, but I think what they kind of uncovered there was, we can be a little sturdier if they run at Shamari as opposed to Trent, who's a smaller, slighter-framed guy. And I kind of see it going that way.
Well, I first noticed this 3 years ago when I was evaluating draft safeties, and I started to notice these guys who used to play 80% free and strong are now 30% slot.
Yeah.
And now it's 35, and now it's 40. So the college game is telling us, and these guys are going to come to the NFL and they're going to do the same thing. So it coming up from, and of course at college, you've got, Josh Hoople at Tennessee, 4 receivers outside the numbers, almost to the sideline, to the boundary, and you're playing absolute spread, and they still have a run game. You have to counter both. So it's that constant chess match back and forth. And I do think that third, whatever he is, I call him defensive backs at this point. It's so nebulous.
Yeah.
But that third safety in name, well, then what is he? How does he fit in? And Spags told me he had very specific ideas about which safety to bring down. When do we bring them down? There were a couple times in the Super Bowl that Reed was able to stop Saquon. So it wasn't just the three linebacker stuff. It was big nickel. And Connor's a good example of a guy that you can sort of toggle between linebacker and safety.
Yeah.
Those guys will become I remember when the Seahawks took Michael Boulware years ago and no one knew where to put him. Michael Boulware would probably be a first team all pro now because things have just changed so much in the needs teams have for certain types of players on defense.
Yeah.
Doug, thanks
Great
as always.
stuff. Thanks, Doug.
My pleasure, guys. Take care.